The year is 1942, and the sands of North Africa are an unforgiving battlefield where reputations are forged and broken. General Erwin Rommel, the celebrated Desert Fox, commanded the Axis forces with a cunning brilliance that became the stuff of legend. His Afrika Corps seemed unstoppable, a motorized spearhead tearing through Allied defenses across the harsh, desolate terrain. Rommel's tank divisions, centered on the reliable Panzer III and the emerging Panzer IV, were masters of maneuver and concentrated firepower. The British Commonwealth forces, reeling from a series of stunning defeats, often found their own cruiser tanks outmatched and outgunned by German precision. Every Allied attempt to halt the relentless Axis tide seemed to falter against the tactical genius and superior German anti-tank weaponry. The situation was dire, threatening to collapse the entire Allied position in the Middle East and hand the crucial Suez Canal to Hitler. A sense of desperation settled over the Allied high command as Rommel pushed his forces deeper and deeper into Egypt. This unbroken string of German victories fostered a deep-seated confidence, bordering on arrogance, within the Wehrmacht tank corps. They believed their doctrine, their tanks, and their leadership were simply superior to anything the Allies could deploy in the desert. This overconfidence would soon be tested by an unlikely and heavily criticized weapon supplied by America's rapidly mobilizing industrial complex. The Americans, while eager to contribute, had been forced to rush an imperfect, stopgap design into mass production to meet the urgent global demand for tanks. This new American machine was entering a war where the rules of tank design were being rewritten by combat experience on every front. The initial reports reaching the German generals painted a picture of a cumbersome, flawed, and fundamentally obsolete fighting vehicle. They scoffed at its unusual profile and its design compromises, comparing it unfavorably to their sleek, effective Panzer models. Little did they know, this awkward new tank was carrying a secret that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the upcoming battles. The stage was set for a dramatic clash of steel and doctrine, where the despised American machine would challenge the prevailing German belief in their own invincibility. Rommel's forward momentum was generating an operational crisis for the Allies that only a sudden and decisive injection of effective firepower could solve. The very nature of desert warfare meant that tanks were the ultimate arbiters of victory, dictating movement and controlling the open battlefield. The tank that arrived in North Africa was officially designated the medium tank M3, but it was universally known by its American or British names, the Lee or the Grant. Its design was the product of necessity and haste, conceived after the stunning effectiveness of German blitzkrieg tactics was demonstrated in 1940. American tank production lagged dangerously behind the modern designs needed to combat the well-armored and gunned Panzers. The primary issue was the urgent need to mount a powerful 75 mm cannon, which was a new and formidable weapon at the time. However, the United States lacked the production capacity to quickly manufacture a turret capable of mounting such a large gun. Engineers developed a compromise, deciding to mount the powerful 75 mm gun in a hull-side sponson, which fixed the weapon's traverse to a limited arc. This gave the M3 a significant advantage in firepower over earlier Allied tanks, but created a major tactical liability on the battlefield. The main gun was difficult to aim on the move, and the entire tank had to be turned to engage targets outside its narrow field of fire. A second, smaller 37 mm cannon was mounted in a fully traversing turret atop the tank, giving it a much-needed second offensive capability. This strange, multi-tiered design resulted in a vehicle with a notoriously high silhouette, making it an easy and obvious target for German gunners. The crew compartment was a multi-level maze, often resulting in poor communication and a stressful operational environment for the 6 to 7 man crew. Furthermore, the M3's armor was joined by rivets, a construction method that could dangerously release deadly metal fragments, or spall, when struck by enemy fire. Despite these critical, acknowledged flaws, the M3 Lee was the best tank the Americans could produce in the necessary volume for immediate deployment. It represented a significant leap from the smaller, less effective M2 light tanks that had preceded it in American service. The tank's powerful 9-cylinder Wright R 975 radial engine provided excellent speed and reliability, a crucial factor in the vast distances of the desert campaign. Its wide tracks gave it good performance over the soft desert sand, a surprising contrast to some of the narrower track German designs. The M3 Lee was essentially a transitional design, a temporary measure intended to hold the line until the more capable and turreted M4 Sherman could enter service. It was rushed into the North African theater under the British designation Grant and later the American Lee to face the imminent threat posed by Rommel. The Allies were fully aware of the tank's deficiencies, but they desperately needed its big gun to counter the range and protection of the best German armor. This awkward American machine was sent to the front lines not as a revolutionary weapon, but as a crucial breathing space for the Allied war effort. When the first intelligence reports and photographs of the American M3 Lee tank reached the German High Command, the reaction was predictably one of derision. Wehrmacht generals, flush with the victories of the Blitzkrieg and confident in their own tank designs, saw the M3 as a relic of an earlier, less sophisticated age of armored warfare. They immediately seized upon its most glaring and obvious weakness, the enormous, boxy profile that towered over the battlefield. German tank doctrine emphasized low silhouettes and sloped armor, designs that prioritized survivability and target concealment. The M3 Lee's height made it an almost unmissable target, a fundamental violation of modern tank warfare principles as understood by the Germans. Its hull-mounted 75 mm gun was dismissed as an outdated concept, suitable only for infantry support and lacking the flexibility required for tank-on-tank duels. German tacticians were masters of using terrain and maneuverability to their advantage, a skill severely hindered by a fixed, hull-mounted main weapon. The Germans also noted the old-fashioned, riveted construction of the M3's armor, a method that they had largely abandoned for the more resilient welding techniques. They viewed the M3 as a symbol of American industrial might, compensating for a lack of design sophistication and an elegant brute force approach to combat. Initial German combat assessments classified the M3 as a tank destroyer or assault gun, given the fixed nature of its main weapon, rather than a true medium tank. This dismissal was further fueled by propaganda, which consistently understated the quality of all Allied equipment and training. The German officers had grown accustomed to facing British tanks like the Crusader or Valentine, which, while capable, often had smaller guns that struggled to penetrate Panzer armor at range. They believed the M3 would be an easy kill, a slow, high-profile target that their 50mm and 75mm guns could dispatch, without significant risk. Rommel himself, a keen observer of enemy capabilities, likely shared this initial skepticism about the M3's combat utility in the fluid desert environment. The belief that the M3 Lee was an inferior, stopgap design contributed to a crucial underestimation of the firepower it actually brought to the fight. This deep-seated contempt blinded the Germans to the tank's single, decisive advantage that would soon prove to be their undoing. They focused on the how, the awkward mounting, rather than the what, the devastating power of the 75 mm shell it could deliver. The Wehrmacht generals were comfortable in their established superiority, a complacency that was about to be shattered in the crucible of the North African campaign. The M3 Lee first saw significant combat action with the British Eighth Army during the tumultuous battles of the Gazala and El Alamein campaigns in 1942. The early combat reports from the desert were mixed, reflecting the contradictory nature of the M3's design and its performance in the field. Its imposing height meant that many M3s were knocked out by German anti-tank guns and tanks before they could even get into an effective firing position. The American crews and their British counterparts quickly learned that exposing the M3's entire chassis to aim the whole gun was a dangerous, often fatal maneuver. However, the powerful 75 mm gun, even in its limited sponson mount, immediately gave the Allied forces a decisive edge they had lacked before. For the first time, Allied tanks could reliably engage the highly armored Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks at significant range. The shell fired from the 75 mm gun carried enough kinetic energy to penetrate the frontal armor of the most common German tanks deployed by the Afrika Korps. This capability was a psychological and tactical game-changer for the British tank crews, who had previously been forced to close to dangerously short ranges to score a kill. The arrival of the M3 Lee also corresponded with a pivotal moment in the supply lines, as the Allies began to receive far greater logistical support than the Axis. While the Germans had better tactical tanks, the sheer number of M3s and other Allied vehicles arriving began to tilt the quantitative balance. The Germans were quickly forced to adjust their tactics, no longer able to engage Allied tanks with the casual confidence of prior battles. German tank commanders realized that the new American tank was a threat that could not be simply ignored or outmaneuvered with impunity. The M3's initial success often came from clever use of hull-down positions, where the tank would use a crest or sand dune to expose only its turret and the 37 mm gun. This tactic minimized the profile, but still allowed the smaller gun to engage lighter targets or support infantry, though the main gun remained hidden. When the M3 was forced to reveal itself, the German gunners quickly found that while it was an easy target to hit, it could often withstand hits that would destroy earlier British designs. The baptism of fire for the M3 Lee was messy and costly, but it achieved its intended purpose. It forced Rommel to slow down and fight pitched battles of attrition. The tank was a brutal reminder that the resources of the American industrial machine were now fully committed to the battle against the Axis. Paradoxically, the most heavily criticized feature of the M3 Lee, its sponson-mounted 75 mm gun, was the very thing that made it a crucial asset. The Allies did not have the time to develop a tank with a turreted 75 mm gun, so the sponson was an engineering compromise that delivered the needed punch immediately. This powerful weapon gave the Allied tankers the necessary confidence to engage the main German tanks on a more level playing field. Before the M3's arrival, the Allied tanks were often relegated to supporting infantry or relying on towed anti-tank guns to deal with the Panzers. The 75 mm M2 or M3 gun utilized a shell with excellent armor-piercing capabilities against the Panzer III and Panzer IV medium tanks of the era. Its high explosive heat capability also made it extremely effective against German anti-tank gun positions and infantry, providing dual-purpose utility. The fixed nature of the sponson meant that the gun could be structurally reinforced, allowing it to handle the powerful recoil of the high-velocity gun. Tank crews quickly adapted by learning a technique called gun laying by chassis, turning the entire vehicle to align the main gun with the target. While slow and sometimes awkward, this maneuver was a small price to pay for the ability to deliver heavy fire at a critical moment in the battle. In static, defensive positions, the sponson was less of a hindrance, allowing the tank to act as a highly mobile, armored artillery piece. Crews would often use the slope of a sand dune or a depression in the terrain to preposition their chassis, aiming the gun across a likely engagement area. The secondary 37 mm turret gun, while less powerful, still proved useful for engaging lighter armored vehicles and suppressing enemy machine gun nests. The combination of the two guns provided an impressive, though complicated, array of offensive options for the tank crew. The M3 Lee was thus able to dominate the battle space with firepower, even if it struggled with the mobility of its main weapon. This sheer ability to hurt the Panzers was a shock to the German commanders who had believed their own tanks held a monopoly on mid-range effectiveness. The sponson was a temporary solution that delivered a long-term impact, changing the trajectory of the desert campaign until a better design could be fielded. It allowed the Allies to buy valuable time for their industrial infrastructure to catch up and produce the next generation of superior armored vehicles. The 75 mm gun, regardless of its mounting, was the difference between holding the line and a complete strategic retreat for the Allied forces. The primary opponent of the M3 Lee during the early phases of its deployment was the German Panzerkampfwagen III, a highly successful medium tank. The Panzer III was a product of the German doctrine of maneuver warfare, excelling in speed, reliability, and tactical coordination on the battlefield. It was typically armed with a high-velocity 50 mm KWK-38 or later the longer-barreled KWK-39 cannon, which possessed excellent armor-piercing qualities. However, the Panzer III's armor, particularly its frontal plate, was often vulnerable to the powerful 75 mm shell fired by the American M3 Lee. In a direct engagement, the M3 could often penetrate the Panzer III's armor at ranges where the German tank would struggle to defeat the M3's reinforced frontal plate. This forced German tank commanders to abandon their frontal assault tactics and prioritize flanking maneuvers to attack the Lee's weaker side armor. The German crews were masters of using the vast, open desert as cover, employing dust and haze to conceal their movements and close the distance for a more effective shot. Despite their tactical skill, the German crews were at a distinct disadvantage if caught in a head-on duel by the M3's main weapon. The M3 Lee's sheer size and its crew's ability to spot targets from the high vantage point often negated some of the Panzer III's lower profile advantage. The engagements became a deadly game of cat and mouse, with the German tankers trying to exploit the M3's limited gun traverse, while the Allies sought to pin the Panzers in the M3's firing arc. The Germans were also increasingly concerned by the M3's rate of fire, which, when coordinated with other Allied tanks, could quickly overwhelm a German advance. The presence of the M3 Lee in the Allied line essentially nullified the clear armor advantage the Panzer III had enjoyed over earlier British tanks. This shift meant that German tank losses began to mount more rapidly than Rommel's limited supply lines could sustain, a critical strategic factor. Every successful engagement by an M3 Lee was a direct blow to the Axis's dwindling manpower and material in the desert. The Panzer III was an excellent tank, but it had met its match in the M3's potent firepower, forcing the Germans to rapidly accelerate the deployment of the heavier Panzer IV. The M3 Lee, a tank initially dismissed, became a primary focus for German tank crews who had to quickly learn its strengths and vulnerabilities. The Battle of Gazala in May and June 1942 was a monumental clash of armor, where the M3 Lee played a significant, if often overshadowed, role in the Allied defense. Facing Rommel's massive flanking maneuver, the Allied forces used a series of heavily defended boxes to anchor their line, leading to fierce, close-quarters engagements. It was here that the sheer weight of the M3 Lee's 75 mm gun was constantly brought to bear against the advancing German columns. The M3s were often used to counterattack German breakthroughs or to support the heavily besieged infantry in the defensive boxes. In one notable action, M3 Grant tanks of the British 4th Armored Brigade successfully engaged and destroyed a concentration of Panzer IVs, a tank that was more heavily armed and protected than the Panzer III. This was a major morale booster for the Allies, demonstrating that they now possessed a tank capable of taking on the best the Afrika Korps had to offer. The limited traverse of the Sponson gun, however, proved to be a liability in the chaotic, rapidly changing conditions of the mobile desert battle. Many M3s were lost when German anti-tank gunners and infantry successfully flanked them, exploiting the time it took to turn the entire tank. Despite the losses, the M3 Lee proved to be a tough, resilient vehicle capable of absorbing a significant amount of punishment and still remaining in the fight. Its relatively thick frontal armor often deflected or stopped the standard German 50 mm shells used by the majority of the panzers. The battle became a punishing war of attrition, with the M3 Lee forming the backbone of the British Armored Reserve, holding the line until ultimate defeat forced a retreat. The heavy losses sustained by the Afrika Korps in the armored clashes were largely attributable to the concentrated firepower of the M3s and supporting anti-tank artillery. Gazala ultimately ended in an Allied withdrawal, but the M3 Lee had established itself as a formidable force that the Germans could no longer simply scoff at. Rommel's forces paid a heavy price for their victory, a price that would prove critical in their final, stalled advance toward the Suez Canal. The fighting at Gazala underscored the M3's dual nature, a design with crippling flaws, yet possessing the essential firepower the Allies desperately needed to stay in the war. The introduction of the M3 Lee was a direct response to a strategic crisis for the British in the North African theater. For years, the British had struggled with a series of tanks that were either undergunned, unreliable, or both against the Germans. The most common British cruiser tanks, like the Crusader, were fast and maneuverable, but their 2-pounder, 40 mm, gun was almost completely ineffective against the frontal armor of the Panzer III and IV at combat ranges. This disparity in firepower was a primary reason for the string of tactical defeats that plagued the British Eighth Army in 1941 and early 1942. The Germans, utilizing the superior range and penetration of their main tank guns, were able to pick off British tanks from a distance with near impunity. The arrival of the M3 Grant, the British variant with a slightly different turret, in time for the Gazala campaign, was therefore a moment of profound relief for the British troops. The American tank represented an immediate and effective answer to the German armor supremacy, leveling the playing field with its 75 mm gun. It allowed the British to go toe-to-toe with the Panzers for the first time without having to rely solely on concentrated artillery or flanking maneuvers. British tank commanders quickly learned to maximize the M3's strengths, using its high profile to get a better view of the battlefield in the absence of a better alternative. The M3 Grant was also one of the first Allied tanks to feature a full crew intercom system, improving coordination within the vehicle, a feature the Germans had long enjoyed. This new American equipment was a physical manifestation of the growing might of the United States fully joining the fight against the Axis powers. The M3 was a powerful, if temporary, injection of industrial capacity and design expertise that saved the British armored forces from being completely neutralized. The transfer of these tanks from American production lines to the desert front lines was a massive logistical undertaking, highlighting the desperation of the situation. The M3's presence signaled a turning point, assuring the British that they would not face the superior German armor alone anymore. Without the M3 Lee and Grant tanks, it is highly probable that Rommel's final push would have succeeded in capturing the vital port of Alexandria and the Suez Canal. No discussion of the M3 Lee is complete without a detailed critique of its most crippling, inherent design flaw: its excessive height. Standing over 10 feet tall, the M3 Lee presented an enormous silhouette against the flat, open expanses of the North African desert. This towering profile made the M3 an easy target for virtually every German anti-tank weapon on the battlefield, from towed artillery to the guns of the Panzers themselves. In desert warfare, where cover is scarce and visibility is high, a low profile is a prerequisite for survival, a lesson the M3 Lee consistently failed to follow. The tank's height was a direct consequence of the multi-level layout needed to house both the 75 mm sponson gun and the 37 mm turret on top of the engine and drivetrain. This vertical stacking of weapons and crew compartments created a literal death trap for the tank's crew when a German shell found its mark. The 6 or 7-man crew had a difficult time communicating across the different levels of the vehicle, particularly when the noise of battle intensified. Exiting a burning or disabled M3 was a dangerous scramble from a high perch, often exposing the fleeing crew to enemy machine gun fire. The top-heavy design also affected the M3's stability when traversing rough terrain at speed, making it prone to rocking and hindering accurate gunnery. Tankers quickly learned that the safest way to fire the 75 mm gun was to use a hull-down position, exposing only the 37 mm turret. This tactic, however, defeated the main purpose of having the powerful 75 mm gun, forcing the crew to choose between firepower and survival. The German response to the M3 was to prioritize its destruction, recognizing that removing the 75 mm threat was paramount to their operational success. They employed a strategy of targeted ambush, using concealed anti-tank guns to hit the M3 at the limit of their range before they could deploy their main weapon. The high profile meant that M3s were visible to enemy observers long before other, smaller Allied vehicles, making them the first target in almost every engagement. The M3 Lee's height was a compromise born of urgency, a tactical liability that all Allied crews knew and feared, but one they learned to live with for the sake of its powerful armament. Despite its flaws, the singular redeeming feature of the M3 Lee was the powerful 75 mm gun, the element that truly shocked the Wehrmacht generals. The standard armor-piercing projectile fired by this gun was significantly more potent than anything the British had fielded in quantity up to that point. The gun's high muzzle velocity and heavier shell allowed it to defeat the frontal armor of both the Panzer III and the short-barreled Panzer IV at standard combat ranges. This was a psychological and tactical breakthrough, as it meant the Allied forces could finally return effective, long-range anti-tank fire. German tank commanders were forced to confront the new reality that they could no longer rely on their own armor protection to shield them from incoming fire. The appearance of the M3 abruptly ended the period of near-total German armor superiority that had defined the opening years of the North African campaign. Furthermore, the M3 Lee was equipped with a significant supply of high-explosive shells for its 75 mm cannon, giving it an additional, crucial utility. The He shells were devastatingly effective against German anti-tank gun positions, infantry squads, and unarmored or lightly armored vehicles. A single well-placed He round could neutralize an entire anti-tank team, preventing them from flanking the other Allied tanks. The 75 mm gun was also effective against the German 88 flak gun when caught unmasked, a weapon that was Rommel's most feared anti-tank defense. The ability of the M3 to switch quickly between armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds made it a highly flexible and dangerous opponent. This versatility was often overlooked in the early assessments by the German High Command, which focused narrowly on the tank's profile. The destructive power of the 75 mm gun forced a fundamental change in German tank tactics, prioritizing caution and coordinated fire over reckless speed. The German need to counter the M3's gun led directly to the rapid rearmament of the Panzer IV with a longer-barreled, more powerful 75 mm cannon. The M3 Lee's armament was a stopgap measure, but it delivered a strategic shock that fundamentally altered the flow of the Desert War and prepared the ground for the M4 Sherman. The ultimate legacy of the M3 Lee is that it arrived at the moment of the greatest Allied peril and played a crucial, demonstrable role in stopping Rommel's relentless advance. Following the costly retreat from Gazala, the British Eighth Army, reinforced by a massive influx of American equipment, prepared for the final, desperate defense at El Alamein. By this time, a significant portion of the Allied armored strength was composed of the reliable and powerful M3 Lee and Grant tanks. Their 75 mm guns formed a critical component of the defensive firepower that was arrayed against the exhausted but still formidable Afrika Korps. Rommel's last major offensive thrust toward the Nile Delta, known as Operation Brandung, ground to a halt against the newly reinforced Allied line. The German tanks and infantry were met with a wall of concerted fire, a volume and lethality they had not previously encountered in the Desert War. M3 Lee tanks, used effectively in defensive, pre-sighted positions, delivered devastating blows to the German armored columns. halting their forward progress. The sheer attrition rate inflicted by the M3's guns proved unsustainable for the Afrika Korps, which was already suffering from overextended supply lines. The German generals' earlier scoffing at the M3's design now came back to haunt them as their own tanks were destroyed by the very weapon they had dismissed. The M3 Lee provided the time and the firepower necessary for the British to reorganize, resupply, and launch their decisive counteroffensive under General Bernard Montgomery. It was the temporary bridge between the era of inadequate Allied tank design and the arrival of the more capable M4 Sherman, which would dominate later battles. Without the M3's immediate, heavy-hitting contribution, the defense at El Alamein would have been much harder, potentially shifting the balance of the entire North African campaign. The tank's high profile and other flaws were a price the Allies were willing to pay for the strategic benefit of its 75mm gun. The M3 Lee achieved a strategic victory despite its tactical limitations, proving that even a compromised design can be decisive when it delivers a superior weapon. The M3 Lee was a flawed but crucial tank whose lessons fundamentally shaped the design of its successor, the iconic M4 Sherman. Engineers at the American tank arsenals paid close attention to the combat reports from North Africa, particularly the consistent complaints about the M3's height and sponson. The primary requirement for the M4 Sherman was a low profile and a fully traversing turret capable of housing the potent 75mm cannon. The M4 Sherman was essentially an M3 Lee turned inside out and improved, taking the proven chassis and drivetrain and correcting the main gun's positioning. The lessons learned from the M3's riveted armor led directly to the M4 Sherman's entirely welded construction, greatly increasing crew safety under fire. The M3's operational history proved the necessity of a powerful, dual-purpose gun for future medium tank designs, cementing the 75mm and later 76mm as the new standard. While the M3 Lee was swiftly withdrawn from frontline service in the European and North African theaters, once the M4 Sherman became widely available, its career was not over. It continued to serve with distinction in the Pacific, where the Japanese armor posed less of a threat, and on the home front for training purposes. The M3 was a powerful, symbolic reminder that American industry could rapidly pivot and produce heavy, effective weapons in mass quantities. Its service life was short, but its impact on the critical turning point of the war in North Africa was undeniable and strategically vital. The contempt initially shown by the Wehrmacht generals was a classic case of underestimating a foe based on superficial design flaws rather than raw capability. The M3 Lee's story is a testament to the fact that in warfare, necessity often dictates design, and that a flawed weapon, deployed at the right moment, can still be the one that saves the day. Its legacy is not one of perfection, but of decisive, battle-winning contribution during the darkest hours of the Allied campaign.